And what he did, he was like, in competition with all these other oil companies. Today it's Standard Oil. And what he did was he went to J.P. Morgan and said, listen, why don't you just lend me the money and I'll sell my oil below cost. And what we'll do is we'll bankrupt all the other companies, all the other oil companies, and we'll get a monopoly on the oil. And that's exactly what they did. So J.P. Morgan ended up owning parts of Standard Oil, also being owned by the Rockefeller. So that's kind of how they do it. And I'd like to do a talk one day called on terrorism, synthetic terrorism made in the USA. I don't know if you realize it or not. The U.S. has invaded Iraq and they've invaded Afghanistan. They have bases in Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, and a lot of those countries around the Caspian Basin. Well, Caspian Basin is the second largest oil reserve in the world next to the Middle East. They have army bases over 90% of the world's reserves of oil. Now you know what 9/11 was all about. Vietnam is an oil-producing nation today. You can go and you can watch, there's a program called Mega Builders, and they're building this big bridge across the Saigon River in, what's the name of, it's not called Saigon anymore, but that's what it is, it's Saigon. It was all about oil. So you can imagine what would happen if that 3% mortgage, say, became 8%. How are these people going to pay for their houses? And, listen to me. The first house that I bought, my wife and I bought in Saskatoon in 1981, we had a 22% mortgage on it. So don't think that they can't go back up to 12, 15%. And your payments are going to triple. What's going to happen? There's going to be a lot of houses on the market. Interest rates are artificially low. And what that does is it puts the price of houses up because people can afford the houses. So there's more people buying houses, puts the prices up. Lowering the interest rates artificially does not bring the price of houses down. It does not make housing more available. It makes it more expensive. So what's happening is we are living in a housing bubble, whether we realize it or not. We're living in a housing bubble. Once rates go back up, they should be about 6.25%. So if they go back up to 6.25%, that's over double what it is right now. And I would expect they'd hit somewhere between 8 and 10%, maybe even as high as 12%. So people's mortgages are going to triple. You're going to get a lot of houses on the market. And the government is going to end up with a lot of houses because they own the mortgages. It's crazy. Now, in 1991, traditionally, banking reserves have been about 10%. The banks keep 10% on hand in case people want to take the money out of their bank. In 1991, the Mulroney government reduced the reserves to zero. And every nation that has gone to fractional reserve banking, that's what they call it, has ended up with reserves of zero. So right now, if you've got a lot of money deposited in the bank and you went down and withdrew that money is not in the bank. But you know what? They're going to give it to you anyway. You know why? Because the government is going to pay it. If you've got $100,000 in the bank and you go down and you say, I'm going to take this out of the bank and put it under my mattress, they'll give you $100,000. They'll write out a check for $100,000. They don't have $100,000, but they don't care because the government is just going to put it in anyway. It's all backed. CMHC. That was the main contributor to the banking bailout, CMHC. So today, 98% of all new money is created by banks making loans. If everybody was to pay their loans back, there would be no money. It's called contraction. A lot of people think that the crash of 1929, resulted in the Great Depression. I'm going to tell you a little secret. Stock market crashes do not cause depressions or recessions. It's contraction of the money supply that causes recession. There's less money to go around. Between 1929 and 1933, the U.S. money supply contracted by fully 1/3. That's what puts people out of work. They don't have money. What causes a bubble? You put a lot of money out there, and it creates it creates the feeling that we're prosperous because we got a lot of money. There's a downside to that. So what's happening right now is private banks are legally counterfeiting money, our national currency, as a matter of fact, and charging interest on it. Our banks are counterfeiting our national currency and charging interest on it. And they're doing it for private gain. Bankers are not in the business for you and I, or for the good of the country. They're in it for one reason and one reason only: for profit. To make profit that Midas could never see. Now, here's the point I want to make, and this is something you need to realize. All money is created out of nothing. All our currency is created out of nothing, and interest is added. And because interest is added to the money that's created out of nothing, there will never be enough money to pay back the debt. It is impossible. Do you follow me? There will never be enough money to pay back the debt because money is created out of nothing and interest is added. Not only that, but it's compounded interest. Let me give you an idea of what compound interest will do. Interest compounded daily at 10%. You go and you borrow $100, you owe $100. Next day, interest is added. It's $10. You owe $110. Next day, interest is added on $110. That's $11. You owe now $121. Next day, interest is added on the $121 at 10%. In 7 days, you will owe $195. In 1 week, your debt will almost double at interest compounded daily. And that's the kind of interest our federal government is paying. There's no way it'll ever be paid back. I don't care what Jim Flaherty says. There's no way. Now listen to me. I'm not against the conservatives. I was a conservative carrying whatever. I was a card carrying conservative. That's what I meant to say. Today I'm not sure who the guy I always vote for is not running again, so I'm not sure who I'm going to vote for. So I'm not knocking the conservatives. I'm knocking the system. Now, the other result of all of this, every time you add money to the financial system, it steals its value from the existing money. Let me give you a good illustration. Say you're playing Monopoly, and everybody's got their money supply. It's all out on the table, and everybody's buying and selling. And you look over there, and oh, look, there's another Monopoly game. Let's take that money, and let's add it to the game. You know what's going to happen, don't you? The price of everything will double. Why? Because the value of your money is now worth half. They call it inflation. That's a misnomer. The better word is devaluation. Every time money is added to the system, it devalues the money you have in your hand. Can you see that? If something is on the table worth $100 and somebody borrows $100 or $20 from the bank, that money, he'll benefit from the $20, but once that money's in the system, now that thing is going to cost $120 because that's what's available to pay for it. That's the law of economics. And so what that is a tax. It's a tax. It's a tax on your existing money. Now, governments love inflation because it devalues their debt. Inflation runs traditionally at about 10%, so it generally doubles about every 10 years. And what that does is it just keeps, if the government owes $1 billion in 10 years, it's going to owe only $500 million because the money has devalued. The problem is any money you try to save also devalues. So what happens in this scenario, low interest rates, is people don't save. They keep borrowing. And I'm going to tell you something. Economic growth always comes from savings. It does not come from borrowing. It comes from savings. When people don't save, when people aren't able to save because of inflation, then that destroys a country's future. Economic growth comes from savings. Give you a good example. Between 1980 and 2005, because of technology and so forth, labor productivity in Canada rose by over 37%. The average Canadian was producing 37% more in 2005 than he was in 1980, and yet the actual income did not rise at all. We're producing over 37% more, but not getting paid any more for it. That's called inflation. Now, here's the other thing that happens. Governments, because their debt is going up at an astronomical level, trying to pay down all this interest, they have to cut programs. And the number one thing they cut is crown corporations. And crown corporations have a return on investment. So when governments sell a crown corporation, once that money's gone, a one-shot deal, now they got to borrow even more to make up for the income stream that was lost. Can you see that? See, in 2012, the government announced the following changes. Increase in the age of eligibility of old age security and guaranteed income supplement from 65 to 67. Changes to admissibility of employment insurance to increase to 5% on increases. $8 billion in public sector spending cuts. And they resulted in 19,000 layoffs of the public sector. Our government has to do these things because of the debt. Now, Mackenzie King was the longest serving Prime Minister in Canada. And he oversaw the creation of the Bank of Canada. And he had this to say: once a nation parts with the control of its currency and credit, it matters not who makes the nation's laws. He could see it. Usury, once in control, will wreck any nation. Usury, once in control, will wreck any nation. And history will prove that it's true. Every nation that has tried to operate its financial system on a fiat money supply ended in disaster, including the Roman Empire. Until the control of the issue of currency and credit is restored to government and recognized as its most sacred responsibility, all talk of sovereignty, of parliament, and of democracy is idle and futile. Until we can restore control of our money supply to the people, all talk of democracy is futile. We are nothing more than high-tech slaves. Now, I want to talk to you about Canada's great experiment. Canada's great experiment. The Bank of Canada from 1934 to 1974. The Bank of Canada was created in 1934 and it was nationalized in 1938. Money was created and lent to the governments and chartered banks with no interest attached. Today, it's created by private banks and lent with compound interest. Now, the Bank of Canada supplying the country with interest-free loans brought the Depression to an end. It financed World War II from 1939 to 1945, financed the Korean War, and in World War II, Canada built the third largest navy in the world. Until World War II, Germany was America was the third largest navy in the world. We had the third largest navy in the world without a heavy national debt. 28 crown corporations were formed to help with war productions. The return on investment went from $3 million in 1940 to $1.4 billion by 1974. In 1974, the government was making $1.4 billion on the return of investments on those crown corporations. There was no post-war depression. The returning soldiers were given work grants, low-interest loans to go into business, buy land, and build homes. The Veterans Land Act gave 140,000 veterans low-interest loans to build houses. Montgomery Place was built. Veterans Rehabilitation Act. 54,000 veterans were able to attend university. And a lot of my teachers in high school were World War II veterans. We expanded the St. Lawrence Seaway at a cost of $400 million. We built one of the world's largest highways, longest highways, the Trans-Canada Highway, at a cost of $1.4 billion. We built hospitals, schools, and colleges for the baby boomers. Medicare began federally in 1957 and expanded to universal in 1966. Old Age Security Act was passed in 1951. Before 1974, there were no food banks. There was no homeless people. Unemployment reached 1%. Canadian companies were self-financing. What does that mean? It means they financed expansion through profits. Today, they do it through leveraged financing, what they call leveraged financing. What does that mean? It means they borrow money from the government, from the banks. So when interest rates go up, banks are going to end up owning the companies too. With all this spending, the national debt was only $18 billion. Your share was $847. Since 1974, it has risen by over 79 times. It's 79 times higher now than it was in 1974 after 40 years of war and all those things that I read out. After 40 years. In the 40 years since 1974, it's now 70 times higher. From 1938 to 1974, government funding was from the Bank of Canada, but after 1974, the federal government ceased using the Bank of Canada and began borrowing from private banks. And that's when our problems began. Now, let me talk about the Bank of Canada. I got a lot of stuff here and I'm trying to get through it all. I want to give you facts and figures because I don't want people calling me some kind of conspiracy theorist. So we're just looking at facts. I know it can be boring, but we need to understand where we're at and where we're going. The Bank of Canada is Canada's national central bank, nationalized central bank. Its role, as defined in the original Bank of Canada Act of 1934, is to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada. Its purpose is to create the country's money supply, to lend to federal, provincial, and municipal governments at low or no interest, to lend to chartered banks, private banks at competitive interest rates. That's its charter. Who owns the Bank of Canada? It was nationalized in 1938 and became a special crown corporation belonging to the federal government. Since 1938, the Minister of Finance has held the entire share capital issued by the bank. In other words, all of the profits of the Bank of Canada go to the office of the Minister of Finances. Doesn't go to private hands. It goes to the government. Is the Bank of Canada a government department? It is a special type of crown corporation with considerable autonomy, and it has to have autonomy. And the reason is simple. It has to be able to separate the power to spend from the power to create money. If you've got the power to spend, you cannot have the power to create. Any man who has the power to create money is like a man who, in a free fall, expecting him to stop creating money is like expecting a man in free fall from stop falling. There's no way. There's no way. Our private banks are addicted to printing money, making it out of nothing. The Bank of Canada was created to be the sole issuer of bank notes and to facilitate the management of the country's financial system. Separating the central bank from the political process enables it to adopt a long-term perspective. It doesn't have to worry about being kicked out of office in the next 4 years. Now, the question is, why are we borrowing money from the private banks? I'm going to give you some facts from the Canadian Auditor General Report, 1993. Our national debt was $423 billion. $37 billion was spent on goods and services. So of a debt of $423 billion, only $37 billion was spent on goods and services. That's a little more than 8% of the total debt. Almost 92% was spent on what? Interest. $386 billion was spent on interest. So in 1992, Canada had to borrow for real spending no more than $37 billion. Yet our national debt was $423 billion. So $386 was spent on compound interest. Compound interest, over 10 times what we needed was spent on compound interest. If we were to pay off if we were to use the Bank of Canada to pay off our national debt, we could eliminate personal income tax. The only reason we have personal income tax is because of the interest that we have to pay. I'm going to give you there was a conversation between Gerald Grattan McGeer. He is the father of the Bank of Canada. He was a lawyer. No, he was a mayor of Vancouver. He was an MP and he was also an MLA. And he asked Graham Towers. Graham Towers was the first governor of the Bank of Canada. And this was in the stages before the Bank of Canada. Gerald McGeer was interviewing Graham Towers. Graham Towers was sent from England to try and fix our money problems. And he was interviewing him. He asked him this question. Will you tell me why a government with the power to create money should give that power away to a private monopoly and then borrow that which Parliament can create by itself back at interest to the point of bankruptcy? He asked him this question. This is a pretty tough question. Gerald Towers answers, if Parliament wants to change the form of operating the banking system, then certainly that is within the power of Parliament. We already have a Bank of Canada. We have something in place today that we can use to free ourselves from this debt slavery. Now, why in the world did they stop using the Bank of Canada in 1974? Because of a thing called stagflation. It was inflation coupled with job loss. I don't know if you remembered it. Back in the late 70s, early 80s. What happened was the Basel Committee, which was struck by the international banking cartel, blamed the inflation, and the stagflation is a better term for it, on the Bank of Canada. But in fact, the stagflation was caused by OPEC. the oil-producing nations. And the reason why is because they had an embargo on oil for those nations that helped Israel during the Yom Kippur War of 1972, which included Canada and the United States. And the price of oil quadrupled. That created an inflationary stagnation in our country. And the Basel Committee somehow, through the media, convinced Canadians that it was the fault of the Bank of Canada. They said we should borrow, we shouldn't print our own money, but we should allow them to print it and borrow it from them. Pretty slick, eh? The other thing is they put it as a condition to joining the G7, which is now the G20. The G20 is 20 nations that all have a privately owned central bank, all owned by the same banking cartel. In other words, if you want to play with the big boys, you got to get rid of that Bank of Canada because we want the profits. Do we want to play with the big boys? That's a question we need to ask ourselves.
Is that how they phrased it?
No, that's how I phrased it. But they wouldn't let us join the G7, which is a trading.
Because that's like one way of selling it. Because what it really is, by the sounds of it, you go there and then some banker is telling all these countries what to do.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The G20 is formed by the governors of those central banks, along with the prime ministers and whatever. The Minister of Finance, Minister of Finance with the governor of the central bank of each country meets, and they call it a G20. But they're all based on the Bank of England model, which is privately owned by an international banking cartel. Since 1974, our economy has been controlled by a private banking cartel whose interest is in making profit for themselves and not the well-being of our country. We need to realize this. Now, let's ask the question, do our politicians understand our financial system? Let me give you Thomas Mulcair's, just to be fair. Let me give you Thomas Mulcair's reply on the debt-based monetary system. I have not studied that, no. The idea that the chartered banks are able to create currency through loans is a conspiracy theory. If you want the Bank of Canada to issue all our loot, go start your own party. And the man interviewing kept peppering him. The crowd began to boo him. And so Mulcair turned around and he says, "Excuse me, but I was a finance minister in Quebec for 5 years." And the crowd cheered. To which he said, "Then it's all the more startling that you have no idea what I'm talking about." Here's a man who was finance minister of Quebec for 5 years and has no idea what this guy's talking about. Justin Trudeau, when asked on reinstating the Bank of Canada, he laughed and said, "That's a conspiracy theory." Jim Flaherty, Minister of Finance, today, "I don't want the government to be in the banking business in Canada." They have no idea. If they do, unbelievable. Does the public understand our financial system? I'll give you a good example. At a talk show, TV talk show, they were talking about this very thing, about bank bailouts and so forth and so forth. And a man stood up and he said, "Why doesn't the government bail out the banks and not the taxpayer?" And everybody cheered. I don't know, does anybody see something wrong with this picture? Governments don't have money. They only have your money. The only money they have is taxpayers' money. Every time the government spends money, you've got to pay for it. Now, where does all this lead? Well, let's look at the British experience. Since the creation of the Bank of England. Bank of England was created in 1694. And in the 120 years from 1694 to 1814, England was at war for 63 of them. Out of 120 years, it was at war for 63. not including the war with two wars with the United States, the War of Independence and the War of 1812. Let's look at the U.S. experience since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Federal Reserve was created December 23rd, 1913. So they just celebrated the 100th year. 100th year. And in 100 years, they have had 18 recessions and 8 wars. First World War, Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War, which went for 30 years, 2 Iraqi wars and an Afghanistan war, plus innumerable other wars, invasion of Grenada, invasion of Panama. We can go on and on and on. Have they benefited from a central privately owned bank? I don't think so. Their dollar has devalued by 98%. The dollar today is worth 1 cent of what it was worth in 1913. Their national debt has increased by 5,000 times since 1913 in 100 years. Have they benefited from having a central, privately owned central bank? No. Why? Because the central bank exists to bring profits to their shareholders and their owners. And how they do it is by skimming the money off of your hard labor through interest. Now, where are we today? Today we are in a bubble, as I said before. We are in a bubble. The Federal Reserve is pumping money in. When they stop pumping that money in, what we're going to see is the American dollar crash. Now, that can mean one of two things for Canada. It can be a place, if we can what's the word, divorce ourselves from the American economy, that puts us in a great place because our dollar will be worth a lot more. And if we can't, our dollar will go down with theirs. So we'll be faced with another recession.
One thing I'd like to say is there's been little bits of time where the Canadian dollar has been worth a little bit more.
Yep.
But the problem with that was the Canadians would drop the dollar so that Canadian and the U.S. would trade with each other.
Yep.
And so now that, so it's like there's a ceiling on it. Now I'm pretty upset because now our dollar is 91 cents to their dollar. So it can go lower, but it can't go above them. So it's not a very good place for us to be in.
Ron, will you have a question and answer period afterwards?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just about done here. I just want to kind of wrap it up and kind of let us know where we're at, where we're going. Because of, really, these are our choices. Recessions will lead to war. You know, they're going to lead to one of two things. They're going to lead to bank reform, or they're going to lead to war and enslavement. Those are really the only two choices I see that we have. Either reform our banking system or we're going to end up in another war. All wars are by and for private banking cartels that make great profits funding them, often both sides. That's a whole other story. I wouldn't even mind giving a talk on all of that. I can give you a lot of information on that. I can give you facts and figures. I can show you how much was invested, how much interest was made. Anyway, that's for another time. Needless to say, you know, our choices are few. Now, the thing about it is, because of the Bank of Canada, Canada is in a unique position. We can throw off the debt-based economic system and return to a state-issued value-based currency, which is what we need to do. That will allow Canadians to get control of their own destiny, because we do not have it right now. It's in the hands of an international banking cartel whose purpose is to make money off of our backs. Private banks do not exist to serve the people, the community, or the nation. They exist to serve their owners and to make them rich beyond the dreams of Midas. Creating money out of nothing and charging interest on it is fraudulent. I don't care which way you look at it, it is fraudulent. And this fraud persists because people are tricked into believing that this is the way that life is supposed to be and no alternative exists. Well, listen to me, friends. There was a time when slavery was thought as being the only way that life can be. And we threw that off. We need to recognize that the rule by debt is slavery and throw it off. It can only continue as long as people allow themselves to believe that this is the way that life is supposed to be. But it is not. It is not. That is not what God intended for man, to be slaves to some debt-creating machine. Since those who benefit from the system are going to resist change, it's going to take a grassroots movement to reform our banking system and use the Bank of Canada as it was meant to be used. Now, having said that, the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform has brought a lawsuit against the Bank of Canada and the Minister of Finance, and it went to court on December 10th, last December 2013. But a ruling has not been made yet. And what they are suing the Bank of Canada and the Finance Minister for is the right of provinces to borrow money interest-free from the Bank of Canada to be used for infrastructure. That is the way the charter was set up, and that's the way that the law should read. But I phoned them today, and a ruling as yet hasn't come down. The solution is really simple. Pay off the debt with debt-free sovereign money created by the Bank of Canada. That's what we need to do. We need to print out $1.3 trillion and pay off the debt. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but essentially that's what it amounts to. We need to abolish fractional reserve banking. We need to abolish fractional reserve banking. Banks should not be allowed to lend out more money than they have in reserve. We need to repeal the Reserve Banking Act. This act delegates the money power to a private banking monopoly. The money power must be handed back to the people. No person affiliated with a for-profit financial institution should be allowed to regulate banking. Did you get that? A for-profit institution should not be allowed to regulate banking because they will always regulate it in their favor for profit. And the last thing we need to do is withdraw from the IMF and the World Bank and sever ourselves from that monstrosity that is spreading neo-colonialism through debt. Of the money that we give to them, which is something in the range of $1.5 billion, they take that and they lend it to governments, third world governments, and create dictators that raise large armies to put their people into slavery. And then you see all these things on television, give to this and give to that because people are starving. The reason they're starving is because we're lending money to that organization that is colonializing them through debt. We got to stop it. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. We've got to stop supporting those colonial systems. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
So you're saying withdraw all your money?
Sorry?
You're saying withdraw all your money?
No.
Oh.
No.
Okay.
And put it in my hand, sure.
See, the problem is, that's not, inflation is going to wipe it out. The only solution that I can see is to get behind some organization, and the only one that I know of, and I'm not making a pitch, but the only one that I know of, if anybody else knows any more, any others, but the only one that I know of is the Canadian Action Party. It's right on their platform that they will reform the banking system. In fact, those 4 points I read at the last there, that came right off of their website.
So what is your overall suggestion? What do you think is the solution? Are you saying that we should go back to the commodity system, put back our money up by gold or some other commodity?
You know, yeah, we talked about this in the car. For me, the issue is still out. I haven't studied it well enough. I know when it's backed by gold, gold is so rare that that the gold market can be cornered, and that's the problem. Possibly we could use silver. I'm not sure. And as I was saying to Scott on the way over here, England worked on a tally stick system for over 700 years. And all the king did was he just took some sticks and put notches in it and then split it in half. He kept half and gave a half out. And he would only accept the tally stick for taxes. And they built the British Empire on the tally stick. And it was the Bank of England that came along and destroyed the tally stick system. But the British economy was balanced and powerful and prosperous when based on the tally stick. Now that's a fiat system, and it worked. So a fiat system can work if it's properly controlled. See, the issue is not what's used, the issue is who controls it. Yes,
How was Iceland able to get rid of the banks?
good one. Oh, I think I ran it up, but I don't think I have it here. Iceland, what they did. Iceland is a country of just under 400,000 people, and their debt was just astronomical. All their banks went bankrupt. What the government did is it stepped in and is at present prosecuting 90 of the CEOs of those banks and are going after another 200. And what they did was they did a, what do they call it now? Pay down. A debt pay down. What happened, of course, is people's houses, the first thing that's going to happen is people's houses devalue immensely. And what they did is they said to the banks is that mortgages cannot be more than 110% of the present value of the house. And the international banking community just had to eat it. They fired the bankers, and they took over, they nationalized their banks.
They made that a law, a legislation.
Yes. They legislated that the mortgages cannot be more than 110%. In other words, if you bought a house for $1 million, your mortgage is now $1 million, but now it's only worth $500,000. What they're saying is that mortgage cannot be more than $550,000, and the banks, you're going to have to just eat it. And they have come out of their recession. And that's what we need to do. We need to let the international banking cartels just eat it. We're not paying you. Get lost. If you want to call it a default, fine. I'm sorry, yeah.
I was speaking with someone, and they were saying that if we were to go back to the gold standard, then there wouldn't be enough money to go around with all the people and everything. Although you were saying something about a silver standard or something.
Mhm.
Maybe it could be like a combination of
Yeah.
commodities. What was that you were saying about, like a tally stick?
Yeah, a tally stick. I forget which king it was, but it was back in 1100.
That worked for...
It worked for over 700 years for Britain.
Okay, the reason why that can't work nowadays is the idea of a stick was literal, it was the fact that they could use sticks. We couldn't hand out sticks that
No.
that
I'm not saying we can go to tally sticks, but what that was a fiat system that worked.
Yes, but it always works on a small scale, you can do that. In ancient times, they used to take, in order to mark a land, they needed a totem. And so in order to say which tribe had which rights to which certain property. And so they did use that tally stick concept. What it was they used clay. And they put a count of their sheep or their cattle or their field indicated, and they wrapped it in clay in a clay envelope, sealed it, and then marked it with the tribe's trademark. And then at that matched also with the seal that was at what they called the temple, or a collection of these same symbols. And that way they could be able to assure which was their property. And they evolved systems like breaking things like a seal in half, so that you can be able to match. You can't match certain
Right,
seals
yeah.
that
That was the idea of the tally stick.
You can't do that kind of system today without something physical that you could do something like break.
Yeah.
And try to match.
Yeah, no, I agree. The thing about it, what I wanted to say was, what we have today is a fiat money system. Fiat means that the money is not backed by anything. It's just created out of nothing. You know, most of it is just numbers in a computer screen. And that's called a fiat system, currency system. It's not backed by anything. So a fiat system can work. And I know what you're saying about gold. It's so rare that it can be cornered, and that has happened. Yes,
What about, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Me.
Yeah, go ahead.
ladies first.
What about the one world currency?
See, here's the thing. If you think it's difficult to get the attention of Ottawa, think of how difficult it's going to be to get the attention of somebody in Brussels or any other place, some one world thing. Here's what I think. I believe that man was created to have free choice, free will. The farther away government is, the less chances of that happening. I believe the only way that we are really going to see true freedom is if we decentralize government. And centralizing the entire world in one place is the wrong thing. For two reasons. That's one reason. The second reason is you have all these politicians talking about the New World Order, but they, you know, the people that want the New World Order are the same banking cartel that has brought us war and famine.
What's up?
So it's fellow in the back. Yes.
Just wondering what your thoughts are on the Bitcoin, being that there's going to be a finite amount,
Yeah.
supposedly.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, we're on that now. You know.
But,
You know.
but it's not finite. Like, that could-
No, I know. The real challenge is to get money creation away from for-profit banking and get it into the hands of the people so we can control our destiny.
Well, that was what I was mentioning to you about the idea behind the Bitcoin
Right.
representing.
It doesn't matter what's used so long as it's controlled properly. But the issue is who creates it, who controls the currency. That's the issue. It should be the people. Yes.
So, if you were like a politician, you're in Parliament, and say let's say you also have a few $1 billion, you're like a multi-billionaire. What would you do then to try to fix things?
I don't know. I'm not that. But what I will say is the first step is education, information. That's the first step. That people would know. And really, what I would be looking for right now is a platform to speak. Because that's what's needed. People need to know. And thank God for the internet, because it's out there. But that's step number one, is education. People have no idea. Like I said, people think when they borrow from the bank, they're borrowing what somebody deposited, and it ain't so. That money is being created for you to borrow. And banks are creating our currency at profit.
But people, if they only have half the information, they're not. It could actually be worse than if they have full disclosure. If they, in other words, if everybody was required to have an economics degree, they would be able to follow it. But we can't do that.
That's not true.
Because of that,
It's simple.
Only partial information being
Yeah.
let out there.
It's very
That leads
simple.
to conspiracy theories.
It's not, yeah, I know, people say conspiracy theory, but that's just their way of defending themselves and their way. They cannot discredit the argument, so they try to discredit the person. And that's what that's all about. It's not difficult to understand. It's not difficult at all. It's very simple.
Can I see if I can articulate what you're saying? Do you think possibly what it is because they don't have like the solution, then they tend towards getting defensive and finding a way to use like the word conspiracy theory to mean you're dismissible?
Yeah, you're a crackpot. Yeah, that's what it is. It's
No, but
discrediting the
take
person.
away that. What I'm getting at is because there's multiple theories out there of people who have differing views.
Yep.
Obviously, if only one of them is correct, obviously a lot of them have got to be junk. And if you do look into their information, you'll find that a lot of the information is ill-perceived and it's not investigated properly, and especially with the audience. If people are going to vote on one thing or the other, they jump to emotional conclusions because they don't understand all the details.
Yep.
They're going to just trust, and that makes each of those groups a conspiracy
Yep.
theorists in
Yeah.
themselves.
What most people agree on, that I've seen, is number one, we have to restore the Bank of Canada to its proper legal use. And number two, we have to get rid of fractional banking, fractional reserve banking, those two things. If we can do those two things, we will be miles ahead.
Okay, but you didn't describe what fractional bank, how it works to the people here. And if they were to trust what you say, they're doing it on trust alone because they don't know. And I know how it works. And the way I'm seeing the debt system, it does come out to balance. Like you said, that money is made from nothing. That's not to the truth. It is backed up by debt. As soon as somebody goes to a bank, for instance, and takes out a mortgage, the house itself that represents the value, that is what money gets into the banking system.
Mhm.
And as soon as the house is paid off, that money goes back.
That's
And
correct.
the bank itself only makes what's called like, it's an interest rate
That's
over and
correct.
above the difference, and that represents their service fee. I agree that it gets bad and they can exploit the issue because they're the middle people, but they do only make an interest rate on.
That's correct.
transactions.
They're making interest on money that's correct, that's created out of
They
thin
don't-
air.
It's not created out of thin air. It's matching what, whatever people's value is on their house. Like if somebody
Right.
comes in and says, I want to buy a house, the house itself acts as the worth of money. So if the house is worth
Right.
$100, that's really cheap. But if it's worth $100, that means $100 goes into the system until that person
That's
pays
correct.
off the house, and then $100 goes back.
That's correct.
Into the.
That's correct.
Into the.
But that money's in the system
it's
for
not
how many
lost.
years? 25 years. But the point is it's new money. That's the point. You borrow $1 million to buy a house, that's new money into the system. And what that does is devalue everybody else's money. That's called inflation. Does anybody not understand fractional reserve banking?
I don't.
Okay.
I feel like I'm confused now after hearing that.
Okay, how fractional reserve banking came along is, people would deposit their gold with goldsmiths, and they would get a credit IOU thing or a piece of paper that's told them how much money they had deposited or how much gold they had deposited with the goldsmith. Now the goldsmiths began to realize that no more than there was always 10%. No more than 90% of the gold was ever taken out. So they started lending the money out. It's kind of like in a poker game. Everybody puts in $20. There's 5 people, they put in $20 to play poker and they get poker chips. And they start playing poker. And that's fine. You win $10, you take your $30, you take your $30 worth of gold out of the bank and go home. But what happened was the banker discovered that he could lend out 90% of the money and only leave 10%. That's called fractional reserve. Only 10% he needed to because nobody ever took all their money out at once. He only needed 10% left in there. Now, what happened is, you're playing poker, and then you realize that this guy's doing this with your money, and you say, well, I'm upset, because you're making money on, that's my money you're making money on. And so the banker says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a cut of the profit. I'll charge 10% to him and I'll give you 5%. And so you're happy now because you're getting 5% on your money. Your money's working for you. Problem is everybody goes to get their money out. It's called a bank run. The bank declares bankruptcy and all the depositors lose their money. That's the problem. But how it really works today is you don't put anything into the bank. The bank creates a bunch of poker chips and hands them out.
But that's where I'm saying you're wrong, because as soon you can't put a whole house into a bank, and so
Well, what is the value of a house?
You put the value of the house into the bank system.
But you haven't paid for that house yet, but it's
That's not
still
that doesn't
loading
matter what
money.
it is.
But that's not the point.
Oh, I see.
That's not the point, Scott. The point is that the money for the house is new money. That's the point. Yes.
Yeah, oh yes, thanks for taking my question. It's a good presentation, but I don't take any issue or umbrance with really anything you've said, but I'd like you to clarify some of the generalizations you've made. Number one, who exactly, I have 3 or 4 questions quickly. Who exactly you refer to, and I quote, the international banking private cartel? Could you name them?
Well, yeah, the Rothschilds,
No, I think, yeah.
the J.P. Morgans, the Schiffs.
No, they're dead.
Yeah, their families are still here. Their banks are still here.
So you're saying that the private U.S. banks control the Bank of Canada?
I'm sorry?
So really then you're saying that the private U.S. banks control the Bank of
The
Canada?
private banks, yes, private banks.
Probably the Europe banks originally.
They're international.
Okay, fine, okay. Secondly, in order to fix the problem, you said that we need to remove ourselves from the fractional reserve system. Now, if you could indeed do that by waving a magic wand,
Yeah.
okay, now it would be like, I'll draw this metaphor, it would be like walking into a factory that makes drywall,
Yeah.
putting a gun to their head and saying, we want you to make rubber ducks right now. You can't do it.
No, I understand.
Okay, now, the question is twofold, okay, so we agreed on that point. If indeed you could remove the fractional banking system, would you agree though that there would be utter chaos? Because if you then eliminate the supply of money that's fractionally, or phantomized, okay, what it would indeed then is cause interest rates to skyrocket overnight because the money supply would be diminished greatly by 90%. Would you agree?
Well, the money supply is already out there.
No. If you could, the question is, if you could, you said, in order to fix the problem, we need to, eliminate the fractional reserve system. But you
Yeah.
can't do it. It can't happen. Would you agree?
Well, I agree. I agree with you what you're saying. It'd be very difficult and it can't be done all at once.
Okay, thirdly then, another generalization is about interest rates, okay? Now, truly, General Motors brought out 0% interest rates 10, 12 years ago. Raising interest rates, okay, because our world now is macro. It's not Canada.
I'm sorry?
Our world is macro.
Right.
The economic system is macro. Indeed, your talk tonight is about Canada. That's fantastic. But it still is all tied, macroeconomically to the ugly head, I think, that you said is private international banking cartels.
Mhm.
All right? So indeed then, how is it even possible, okay, in our lifetime for interest rates to increase?
To increase?
Increase. It's like trying to wean a 12-year-old, off his mother's breasts. It's going to have an enormous amount of noise and chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
But it can't happen.
Oh, it will happen.
How? Please,
It will happen.
How?
When the Federal Reserve stops putting money into the system.
But why
Well,
would they do that?
why would they do that?
Because remember.
How long can you keep pumping up a flat tire that's got a hole in it?
As long as they're able to print the press. Remember, we have Poland, we have Portugal, Spain, Greece. It's all
Right.
right.
That doesn't make it good though.
But what happens is the dollar keeps going down.
For the sake
I
of
agree.
printing.
I don't disagree. But indeed, at the end of the day, it will not ever happen.
Oh, I disagree.
But
I disagree, too.
what would be the catalyst to make it happen?
The dollar collapsing.
Well, then we print more money. It's all.
No, but that is what will make it collapse.
Yeah.
Okay, if the system were to continue that way, give us a timeline.
I'm sorry?
Give us a timeline. If that system were to continue, as you suggest, give us a timeline.
You mean before the dollar collapses?
50 years, 100 years?
Soon.
I'd be surprised if we get out of 2014.
Really?
I mean, it's built on sand.
Okay, so then give me then a premise for why interest rates will go up, or why they will stay the same, or why they will actually decrease.
Interest rates will probably go up because.
They're artificially low right now.
Nobody's
They would
making
normally
any
be
money.
about 6.25%.
But artificially low, that's correct, they are, sir. But they are artificially low because the money supply is so large. Whenever there's an overabundance of something.
Right.
It doesn't create a cost.
But nobody's making any money on their investments right now.
That's right.
Like
The
1%.
fly in the ointment is inflation, the devaluation of the dollar. The thing about it is when government, trying to change the laws of economics is like trying to stop the tide. You know, you can only hold it back for so long, and all you're going to do is make a flood. The laws of economics will take hold. The laws of economics dictate that interest rates should be about 6.25%. If there's to be true economic growth, and if there's going to be true savings, with interest rates artificially low, people are not saving, they're borrowing.
Or they're
And you
spending.
cannot borrow the future. You can't pay debt by borrowing more.
It's making people buy houses and cars because interest rates
Which
are
puts
so
the-
low.
which puts the price
And
up.
then they're gonna be, yeah, but one day it's gonna crash.
Oh, I don't disagree.
It's kind of like a Ponzi scheme, really.
Oh, yeah,
I mean, it's the
definitely.
Same thing. It's
You know,
the
and
same
it's the other
thing.
thing, you know, you can see it today, you know, General Motors saying, you know, interest free this, interest free that. You know, they did that, you know, through the 90s and the early 2000s, and that's why they had to get a bailout.
I still think you're missing something. Okay, the treasury bills that I was referring to, those bills are used to make the money. The cost of making the money and like working with it. We know that the bills, for instance, that get handled will depreciate in value and have to be returned and burned. So they have to keep an accounting system as well. And that's the cost of buying the treasury bonds and why it's considered a debt in the future. It encourages people to put money into the system in a promise that they get a little bit of return in the
For
future.
1%?
But that's only that's only the cost for the paper. That's nothing to do with the actual worth of the money, though.
There ain't no money. They're just printing it out.
No, that's
There
not the
isn't
case.
any.
The money is just IOUs that banks are granted a right to a business fee to work between the government and where the bills are made. They don't create money themselves.
Let me tell you what
Well,
happened.
I mean, that's what.
Let me go back to a thing in history that happened. In the American dollar was made the currency of reserve after the Second World War. Up until then, the British pound was. But it was made the currency of reserve on two conditions: that it be backed by gold at $35 an ounce, and that the Federal Reserve do not overproduce the money. Well, the Federal Reserve, being a private bank, overproduced the money. And during the Vietnam War, France saw all these dollar bills. And what other countries had to do was they had to supply the U.S. with raw materials for dollars. So France began to see that this doesn't look good. You know, the U.S. is spending a lot of money on the war, and they wanted to trade their money in for gold. They had all these American dollars. They wanted gold at $35 an ounce. The problem was there was no gold. The U.S. did not have enough gold to back up their dollars at $35 an ounce. So Richard Nixon separated the dollar from gold.
What was
and-
Hitler chasing then?
And then what he did was he went to the Middle East countries, Saudi Arabia and all those little countries, and he said, we will protect you if you will if you will sell your oil in dollars only. And then those dollars have to come back to the United States as you buy our goods. You know, when the mafia does it, they have a name for that, don't they? You know, protection money, you know, or burn your house down. So the dollar then ceased to be backed by gold and began to be backed by oil, which it is today.
No, it's backed by debt. It's
Yeah.
backed by all the individual debts that people do when they go in to take a mortgage. If somebody buys a house,
It's backed by debt, I agree.
I have a house. What I do is I want to sell it. Now the bank buys it all out, and in other words, they pay that person the whole amount of money. Now the bank is out of the cost of the house.
Yeah.
In order for them to make it back,
They create that
what
money,
they do-
though.
What they do is they say to the person who's buying the house that they have a debt upon the house,
Yeah.
and so now the debt represents the money. So the
That's
person is
correct.
just starting to pay, but they haven't bought the whole house. The rest of the whole house that hasn't
Yeah,
been paid
yeah,
for.
yeah, no,
is
you know what,
considered
we're
a
saying the
debt.
same thing in different terms.
But
When you
what
take
I-
out $1 million
but what I'm
mortgage,
saying is now
the
that
bank
debt-
creates the $1 million for the house.
But the
When you
debt-
pay
the
that
debt-
mortgage off over 25
okay.
years, you're gonna pay $3 million with the interest. The bank is gonna make that interest, that is correct. And that money goes out of the first million goes out of circulation. But now there's another 2 million, which was the interest.
I think what he's saying is that in the example you're saying, it's true that the house becomes surety for the loan.
Yes,
However, what he's saying is that they didn't take the money out of something they own.
They
In other words,
created it.
if you were to get a mortgage from me, I'd have to give you money that I own, and the house would be surety that you'd pay it back. But in the bank's case, they didn't have the money.
They don't have the money.
Created it,
They
and
created
yes,
it.
now that becomes surety for what they created.
No, they own the house. The bank owns the house
yes,
until the person.
but the
pays
money
it
was
off.
created, that's the thing. Now, here's another scenario. What if now there's there's a crash in the economy and the house is only worth 500,000? Now you're paying mortgage
I don't know, you're
on $1
confusing the
million
issue.
and the house is only worth 500,000.
Yeah, like the States, like what happened in
Yeah,
the States.
what's happened all through Europe.
Yeah.
There's a 12-year-old girl who does a beautiful video.
Yes,
of this.
Victoria, yes.
She's a Canadian
Yes,
girl,
I've
she
seen it.
explains
Yes.
it perfectly.
It is very
It's
simple.
so
Yeah.
simple.
It is very simple.
Jeez.
You know, everything works fine if people just keep going further into debt. Everything works fine. But the problem is inflation. The problem is their money is worth less and less and less. And the more money that the governments put in to try and shore it up, the less the money is worth. That's the problem. And that's why it always goes boom and bust. That's why the United States has 18 recessions in 100 years. Yes.
Example.
Sorry, they got a machine running out here.
An